And I've got to say, it was probably like 3 or 4 years ago of him making near $1 million a year in revenue through support on his own as a one-man band. And that seemed pretty incredible.
This is Nathan LeClaire, independent coder and author, and you're listening to Coffee Moguls, the podcast interviewing internet entrepreneurs and icons who are tackling unconventional problems and getting unconventional results. On Coffee Moguls, we do deep dives so you can unpack what's behind their success, so you can get the edge you need in your career and in your business. Most of our guests and audience members love caffeine, so brew up a cup and settle in. Let's drink some coffee. Let's pump some iron. Let's start a company. It's Coffee Moguls. It's Coffee Moguls. But first, the disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only and is not financial advice. The opinions are personal and not professional advice. Consult with a financial advisor before making any financial decisions. Today is Tuesday, July the 13th, 2021, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the show today Alex Ellis, who runs an independent software company and was the founder of OpenFaaS and Inlets. How's it going, Alex?
Hi, Nathan. It's going great. I was actually just listening to one of your previous podcast episodes with Chris Biscardi and really enjoying the angle there of independent work and hoping to touch on some of how I've been able to do that in my career as well.
That's great. Yeah, I think we'll get into a lot of those same topics, and you have this really unique perspective. Alex, for me in my life, is one of these people that always helps me learn more and do better, and importantly, is a person who's always telling me to charge more, which I think everyone needs at least one person in their life that does that.
For me, one of the people, rest in peace, was Dan Cohn, and he was the CEO of the CNCF and started that whole movement. And I remember just him, when he heard that I was going to go independent, he said, just whatever you're charging is not enough. If you're consulting on Kubernetes and you're giving this expert information away, or if it's on OpenFaaS, whatever, you're just not charging enough. And I floated some numbers and he said like triple it. And so I remember we had this conversation because you're in a similar position to me. You've sort of fallen into self-employment without actually setting up a strategy and thinking that's what I'm going to do for my life. One way or another, you've just got there. And so that's what happened to me in early 2019. I was working at a big enterprise company on OpenFaaS and had a team around me, and they just changed direction. And so our team was disbanded, and I figured there's more work to be done on OpenFaaS. We were just starting to see some real traction with enterprise companies, and I wanted to carry it on. I wasn't ready to stop. So I found a way to do that, and it just turned out that the only person that would give me a no strings attached job to work on OpenFaaS was myself.
Yep.
Now,
so you kind of set out on your own, and did you think I'm going to also do consulting, or was it also pretty incidental?
So what I thought and what happened, two completely different things. They couldn't have been further apart. So for one, I thought that the top 5 enterprise companies were using OpenFaaS in production, relying on our kind and generous donations of time and energy and intellectual property. They'd just sponsor it and support it. They didn't. And that fell on deaf ears. So unfortunately, that part of it didn't work out. Just didn't get any traction there with end user companies sponsoring. It did get some cloud companies sponsoring, like DigitalOcean and Rancher Labs, which was a nice, initial boost whilst I was trying to figure out how to earn money. Then I thought it would be, okay, well, these companies don't want to sponsor because businesses don't understand the value of sponsorships. They need to get something back. So I offered commercial support, and they didn't want that either. Despite heavily using it and asking loads of questions on Slack and needing pull requests on GitHub, they didn't want to pay for that. Mm-hmm. And so I figured maybe it's not the service that's the problem. Maybe it's the customer. And what I did was press in and hope. And actually now in July 2021, I'm getting inundated from enterprise companies who are saying, look, we've evaluated OpenWhisk, Knative, and Kubeless. We're looking at OpenFaaS and we need commercial support. How much is it? So it's taken me 2 years to get to that point. And in the meantime, to pay the bills, I've ended up developing this business, consulting business around developer content and marketing.
How did you build up your following? What was that journey like? Where did you start from? What have you found to be effective in building an audience? And yeah, what are your lessons there?
So one of the things that I did early on, it's probably where we met, is probably going to say 2016, late 2015. I got interested in Docker and I wrote like an online course, hands-on Docker labs, and the Docker team liked it so much they reached out to me, said this is even better than what we're writing, and they wanted me to be a Docker captain, and then that encouraged me to write blog posts about Docker, and I would do one every weekend, go and have a coffee or something and write a blog post about Prometheus, and people liked them. And then they ended up in newsletters, and people started to follow me on Twitter, started to use it and promote what I'd been writing about, and slowly grew a number of followers. I can't say that I'm sat there with 500,000 followers, but it's 26,000 on Twitter, have other places that I post stuff to. And I guess that's how I did it, by writing about things on my technical blog, sharing them, connecting with the brands. For instance, I remember Jenkins had released this Blue Ocean product, like a new UI for Jenkins, and I just wrote my first impressions on it. And obviously they loved that because I now know that you could probably charge a company $25,000 for that blog post.
So true. And I think this is a common thing that happens to engineers is they really undervalue themselves. When they write a blog post like that, they're not thinking, oh, this is worth 25 grand to someone. They're just sharing content that to them, it's like breathing. So they don't see what's so special about it. But when the marketplace is harsh out there, right? Technical talent isn't just flinging content everywhere.
You need the right client for that, and you need the right brand, and you need to be able to create results to charge that kind of money. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a target for people to aim for. What I'm saying is that this kind of skill takes time to develop, and it's not necessarily hard, right? So perhaps you're going to write a blog post about a new feature that you've put into your open source project or your product or your SaaS. Well, think about it from the reader's perspective. Who is the audience and what are they going to get out of that? So rather than we've added logs to OpenFaaS, it should be something maybe around track down those problems with your functions in real time. And then talk about maybe use a framework like the format, which is why. Why should someone care about this? What is it? How do you use it? And then the most important bit that people always forget is what could you go on to do with it? And how would I further develop this idea? And how can you relate it to your everyday life and go on to use it?
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, it's marketing 101, right? To know your audience and to target them. And yet it gets forgotten constantly. How do you keep that in the front of your mind and kind of enforce that?
It's like your spider senses. When you write something and you've hit the wrong note or you've targeted the wrong audience, you don't get an angry email. What you get is you get nothing. And that's how you know.
We were talking a little bit earlier about persistence and just the role of that. Just keep going and going and going. And you don't want to be stubborn, right? Where you're working on something that just doesn't work at all. But that iterative nature, I think it's hard because sometimes you're just really laboring into nothingness.
It can feel that way. I look at OpenFaaS and the adopters file and the multi-million and billion-dollar companies using it in production. And then I can count how many sponsors, and believe me, it's not many. The dollar amount coming in on a regular monthly pledge on GitHub is $1,000, right, a month. Nobody can even live on that. So that is frustrating. But with OpenFaaS, as I say, this last 2 years of independence, I'm now seeing these asks from enterprise companies because they want to run it seriously. And there's been a degree of persistence there, but it's basically every week I think about completely quitting the project. Of course I do. It's so disheartening to be taken advantage of like that. Now, I can dig into that a little more because there's a book called Strategic Product Marketing. And I saw this because somebody talked about their failed startup on Hacker News. They mentioned the book. And what it talks about is actually by a guy called Alexander Chernev. He's a PhD researcher. is that there's three parts to an offering. There's the community, which is perhaps your users. But let's say there's your customers. They're the people buying it or making use of it. There's your community, which may be your partners, maybe co-developers, maybe co-founders. And then there's the company who is actually producing this. In open source, what tends to happen is the customers and the community get all of the benefit and the company gets nothing. It doesn't capture any value out of that. It's like you think about a stool. The reason that they have three legs is it's easy to get them level. And I know that because I built my own stool for my shed and I had four legs on it and gradually had to get sandpaper and find out which leg was the wrong length and keep sanding it down. And my neighbor across the way said, well, if you'd used three legs, it would always be level because it always levels its way out. Well, let me tell you, if you took my three-legged stool and you cut one leg off, what would happen? I'd all flat on my face, right? Probably break my nose. And that's what's happened with open source. So when you have a project that you're interested in, you put your innovation and intellectual property into that and you put it out there, you're basically saying, right, this is going to benefit the customers, going to benefit the community, maybe contributors who go and put OpenFaaS on their CV and benefit from that. It doesn't benefit the company. So I think that is something that we really just got to get real with. If you want to build a product, if you want to solve a problem, really got to come up with your own strategy, one that's going to last. And that strategy needs to have an element of income and revenue. You need to know who the person is that's going to pay you for this, what problem they have, and you need to know that it's urgent enough for them to be willing to part with cash. These are all classic things in sales that I think salespeople could really help open source, but we just keep ignoring.
Right. There's tons to dig into there. So, for instance, we've talked a little bit before about the issue of pain. Usually the best product fits have some sort of pain that they solve, and that's what gets people to actually part with their hard-earned cash. You can give them the solve that fixes that pain. And sponsorships on GitHub, for instance, what pain are those companies in that sponsoring you on GitHub is going to resolve?
Well, in that case, it's preventative, because if I get fed up with taking advantage of by billion-dollar companies and rage quit and delete all of the source code, they're going to be crying.
Yeah, they are. They really are.
I think it's very unlikely that I would do that, but it's unclear to them that is even a possibility. I mean, the other thing is, God forbid, the COVID factor, right? There's other people that know OpenFaaS, but is anybody going to care enough to sacrifice all of their earnings and free time to work on this thing? It's very unlikely. Likewise, an end user company, do they really want to develop a team of 5 full-time engineers to maintain the project? Probably not. So there's preventative, there's pain relief, but there's the other one is status, right? So I think there's pain, there's status, and then there's fear of pain, which is perhaps where we're now seeing more of those enterprise leads coming in now, these inbound leads. In fact, I had a conversation with a bank in Singapore today, and they said, well, we were going to go ahead with the open source solution, and then our management said, well, we really will be more comfortable if there was a commercial solution we could buy instead and have support.
Yep.
Now that is something that I am encouraged by. Now I look at Sidekick. It's a queue runner for Ruby, and the guy that runs it, he had a post on Indie Hackers, and I've got to say it was probably like 3 or 4 years ago, of him making near $1 million a year in revenue through support on his own as a one-man band, and that seemed pretty incredible. Okay, like not a lot of money in startup terms, but that's certainly enough for him to live comfortably and hire someone to help him with that support.
Exactly. I mean, once you get into those kind of figures, you're starting to think about, hey, should I hire some more people, build out a real company here? But that could also be not exactly what developers have in mind too. I mean, I think some people get into it because they just want to work on their project all the time.
So one of the things that you're going to have to be aware of and careful with is Now that Nathan doesn't have a full-time job and you've got that apartment to pay for, is what do you do with your time? And one of the books I've been reading is Time Off by John Fitch and Max Frenzel. And they talk about having leisure time and reintroducing that. We almost worship at the foot of busyness. Being seen to be busy is like a sign of honor, right? And what they do in the book is they explore antiquity, and they say, a lot of the philosophers that came up with world-changing ideas and developed civilization had a lot of leisure time, and that you need this time of retreating and being on your own and solo and being comfortable on your own time, not loneliness, but actually having deep thought and getting into a point where you're actually in the zone. So, for instance, I have this shed in the garden, and I just had this real urge to build a bench out of wood. And originally, it was just going to be for potting up plants, right? So you put the soil on there, you put the plant, you put the seed in, and then it was just too nice. So I cleared out the shed, put this bench in there, and then it was too cold. So I figured out how to insulate it, bought all the equipment, had my neighbor round, and we cut all the wood up, and it looks great now. And then I wanted a stool. So I built this stool, and I built it out of wood, just followed a plan on the internet, learned about different varnishes. And actually, that deep work and that time away from the grind and worrying about why companies weren't sponsoring OpenFaaS helped me have the space to come up with some different ideas and also to feel more refreshed and feel like I did want to continue with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. It kind of reminds me of, in a larger way, this idea that you could be working on some coding problem, pushing into later hours at night, trying to fix it. And then what you really need is just to step away and just have a night of sleep. And then you come back and fix it in 5 minutes the next morning.
Yeah, that happened to me on Friday. And I think the feeling is hitting your head against a brick wall. And what builds up inside of you is just stress, cortisol. And you're sat there burning away with this, like, why isn't it working? Keep trying things. Like you say, if you walk away, give yourself some space. You don't have to go and build a shed. Even like a 10-minute walk or getting a cup of tea can be enough to get that idea.
Exactly. But I also do find that some of that kind of physical engagement, that real work in the world, can be fulfilling. I know for me, for instance, I like cooking. So sometimes I'll make some scones or something like that. And that really ability to work with something tangible instead of just bits we're pushing around in the ether, for me, is very grounding. So I like the idea that you do carpentry. And actually, I really love the Grow Lab project. I think that's something really cool.
One of the things about Grow Lab is that it does give you a chance to work with your hands, but it also helps feed that addiction to computers that we all seem to have. So you get a bit of both,
Yeah.
And then you can monitor what you're doing. You can see nature doing its thing. You can create this time lapse, but you also get to go and say, right, I'm going to build a little frame for this thing, and I'm going to set up a Raspberry Pi and install Linux and take photos. Now, one thing I did hear from a lot of people that were taking part was that they felt like it improved their mental health. They felt like even if they didn't want to do Grow Lab, it was refreshing for them to see that somebody had created this and that other people were taking part. With your cooking, you're learning new skills. You're being very present in the moment. You're looking at how that dough is sticking to your hands. You're thinking about if you need to add a bit of water. You're connecting. Maybe you're tweeting the photo afterwards. You're giving some cookies to your neighbor down the road. The same with the carpentry. I've made keyboard rests, sent one to a guy I know in Berlin, and he was overjoyed with it. Another one to a guy down the road. And it's also helped me to connect with my neighbor who helped me with the shed and get a really deep sort of friendship going there.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, that really is the key, don't you think? Just connection with other people. That's kind of what we're all here for.
Yeah, connection is very important. It's one of the reasons that I'm able to offer to companies like DataStax or Linux Foundation, Equinix Metal, these sort of originally talked about it as content, but it's more than content. It's really some form of understanding their unique benefits and selling points, and then being able to address developers, that persona. And the only reason I'm able to do that is because I am that persona. If I had to reach doctors, I think I'd have a hard time.
Totally. Even within the kind of larger giant umbrella of being an engineer, it could be tricky to try and say write a blog post about, I don't know, for me it might be like GraphQL. Like I've heard of GraphQL, I've used it a tiny little bit, but I'm no expert on it, and so I would have to be doing lots of research and stuff.
That might be perhaps why your content package may be better priced as 5 figures, because you're probably doing R&D on that for 3 to 5 days. You're writing it, you're getting it reviewed, you're honing it to the audience, you're using your personal channels to promote that. You may be putting up code examples that's intellectual property that you're creating. And I'll give you an example. Like I wrote a blog post for Sivo, one of my first clients, in 2019, and they're still getting people tweeting about that blog post and trying their product today after that original investment.
Precisely. I mean, that's the power of content, and also why I do think it is justifiable to charge so much if you are correctly hitting that need. If you're just going to make something that doesn't do anything to move the needle for their business, that's kind of a different story.
Why are you doing it in that case? The cost to acquire a customer is insanely high. And I can imagine that with a lot of these platforms, it's the same. Now, one thing that I've liked about doing self-publishing, and I guess, yeah, Daniel Vasilo to some extent inspired me because I saw that he did it and did well. Basically, if you write about something that you know about and you don't spend too long researching it, because it's something, there's probably others that are going to be interested in this. And if you charge enough money for it, they'll pay for that, right? And when you release your first one, you have perhaps you have no audience, but then you'll get people that have bought it. They're now potentially on your list. So the next time you have a product, you have a list of people that will pay you money and that trust you.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about segmentation. Like you mentioned, the second book didn't do very well. It seems really obvious after the fact that, yes, it was a niche topic and you just had it, so you just kind of shipped it anyway. But how did you then go from that second book where you didn't do very good numbers to deciding what the topic should be for the third one and then having something that was more well targeted?
Well, Serverless for Everyone Else has sold 500 copies. The net booting workshop is 160, right? Which I'm fine with. And then the Everyday Go is already at 300 and almost 350 today. But what was interesting was that to get to that point was way quicker. Like it's almost level in revenue with Serverless for Everyone Else now, because I was able to start from a higher charging point because I knew what I had was unique there. Now, part of why that is unique is why do we need another Go book? You know, one of the people on Hacker News that saw the story, I shared it with you, didn't I? They said, oh, this is really bold. You're trying to sell a book that doesn't have 800 pages. I could pay $30 for a book that has 800 pages in it. And I remember reviewing a book on Go that has 800 pages, and it wasn't congruent. It was very loosely tied together, and half the content I didn't care about.
Kind of like lines of code or something. The number of pages in a book doesn't necessarily reflect the value that you're going to get out of it.
Yeah, I think the original count was something like in a PDF, 100 pages, and if it was on an EPUB, it was 200 pages. And what I've done is created a book about Go that is practical, based upon personal experience that I have of building a project with over 27,000 GitHub stars, dozens of commercial companies using it in production. The guy that wrote the 800-page book, I've never heard of him. Right? I don't know if he even uses Go.
Yeah.
Now, understanding the unique selling point is super important for marketing what you're doing. And so that's what I did with it. And to begin with, I was thinking, well, this is useful for everyone. Beginners, medium, intermediate, advanced. And then I remember reading in one-page marketing from Alan Dibb that if you think your product is for everyone, then you don't understand anything about your product. So at that point, I was like, no, maybe this is just for beginners and intermediate. And I think it started to make more sense. And I saw more people at that level purchasing it.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of targeting and you deliberately thinking, hey, there's this need in the market where I don't see anything that has the same offering as this Go book. That's the kind of stuff that really helps drive results. And I think that's a difficult issue for developers or engineers in particular to get their head around, right?
Yeah. Here's the thing. There's a pricing curve explained in Don't Throw the Dice from Redgate Software Company. And they talk about $0. You've got a complete market. Everyone will buy your product, right? Who has an interest in it. As soon as you start charging $5, the freeloaders disappear. The people that used it because it was free will not use it anymore, despite being able to afford it. When you go to $10, $20, $30, $50, $1,000, at some point on that curve, there's an optimum point between the price per unit and the number of customers. And you can take that too far to the point where you start to lose out. Now, you can't understand necessarily what that is, but if we look at the price point and the sales of serverless for everyone else versus everyday Golang, we're talking about almost 150 less units and yet very similar revenue. Why? Because they're able to charge more. Yes, it's 150 less people, but actually it's almost the same amount of revenue.
Yeah. So we're kind of getting to a little bit of time here, but I did want to make sure we cover just some more discussion about open source. So you've been going through an interesting kind of phase transition with Inlets, for instance, which is a project that you're working on that has both open source and paid components. And tell me a little bit, like, how has your strategy changed over the years, and how are you thinking about monetizing open source and that kind of thing?
Yes, so I think it goes back to what I said right at the beginning about that stool with the 3 legs. Legs of value creation and capture, right? The customers don't create value. The community, perhaps a little, but the company creates most of the value there. And in terms of capture, it's the customers and community that capture it all, and the company, very little, if not nothing at all, might be negative. So when you put it in that frame, you have an open source project that fulfills the need. Why would somebody pay you for your paid version? Well,
Exactly.
perhaps it's for different use cases that it enables, and that's certainly something that I've seen with Inlets Pro. Perhaps it's a different persona. Perhaps this company wants support, and that I've seen as well. But actually, at some point, we're so used to consuming open source projects like Argo, Kubernetes, Prometheus, Grafana. Who would think of paying for Prometheus when it works so well for free? All of these different things. And so when it comes in, let's open source, like, yeah, I'll spend 5 days getting this to work. Then I'll write a blog post so that if I forget, I can come back to it. Well, you could have paid probably $300 for a year's worth of access, where let's just think about your day rate if you were a consultant. $300 for 5 days, you're working at a very cheap rate. But now you also have support for the whole year. Well, if you're going to pay someone for support even for 1 hour, it would probably be $300 if you didn't have an agreement in place. So developers think a lot about price, but they never really consider the cost. What is the cost to them if they have a flaky solution, if it's insecure, if they're having to fork it and maintain their own builds? What if they need integrations? What if they need help from the creator? They won't be able to get it. Now, that is the cost. So when you say, well, actually, if I pay this price, this is what I get, it's something that even I, as originally a developer, now a business owner, I didn't understand. And I think I would be that person spending 3 weekends trying to get WireGuard working just so that I could, port forward Kubernetes rather than paying ngrok $5 a month. That would probably have been me. But now I've learned, and I've listened to Zig Ziglar. I've gone and sort of understood this idea of price versus cost. But it's difficult. Developers are very hard to convince, right? Especially for tools. So one thing that I did is I created a paid version in Inlets Pro. I made all the automation for it only work with Inlets Pro. I only wrote documentation and tutorials about Pro. And there's still developers who will come and sort of read it all and convert it for the free version and muck about on their own time and even ask for help, right? It's incredibly frustrating. Maybe you can hear it in my voice. I actually tweeted about this and wrote about it in my newsletter. There was 160,000 downloads of the binary. And that's not in all time, just recent time. It's a lot of traffic, right? 160,000 downloads. How many GitHub sponsors were there? 1. How much revenue? $25 per month.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's unfortunate, right? Because I think a lot of us, at least at one point, probably aspired that like we like working on open source. It's really fun, and we kind of like that shared community. We do like helping people out, offering something of value for free. We've benefited a lot from free things, whether it's Linux or Docker or whatever. But then the kind of commercial reality of it is oftentimes, you really don't just push something up and then kind of dust off your hands and collect GitHub sponsorships every month.
Yeah. You have to change the conversation. If I delete the repo, then people may complain and think that I'll do the same with other stuff I create in the future. If I leave it there, then I've still got 160,000 downloads, which is a good thing to brag about, but it's doing me no good. So what I decided to do in the end is I wrote a bit of code to delete all of the release binaries, and I delete the Docker image, archived the project, and said, look, because I'd introduced this notice in the project 6 months ago that it'd been replaced by Inlets Pro. And that's what I've done. Already had the first person come into Slack and said, oh, hey, I can't download it. I said, have you read the notice? It says that you should buy Inlets Pro, and we've got this offer, and we'll do it for half price for you. And he goes, oh, so you mean all I have to do is fork the code, check it out, build my own binary, put it in a container, deploy it to my infrastructure, and then I'll be fine again, will I? And he completely missed the point.
Yeah, what you're describing is a disqualified lead.
Non-buyer, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's always the trade-off with open source. So that's all great stuff. I'll definitely link to your books and to Inlets in the YouTube description. And Alex, do you have anything else you'd like to plug before we go?
I guess the only thing I'd say is if you're thinking about doing something and you feel like you don't have the time, maybe that's your self-talk or what you tell other people. Maybe set some goals. Go and have a listen to Jim Rohn. Think about what you want out of your life. If you are actually in control, or if you're just being like computer interrupt driven. Is it notifications? Is it what other people want that's driving your life? Just think about what you want. Go and look at what I'm doing, what Daniel's doing. Look at some other indie developers. I think even if you want to stay in an employed position, have a look at the way we're living our lives and see if there's something in there for you.
That's a fantastic message, and I'm looking forward to maybe going on your live stream and talking more sometime. Alex, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.